neighborly manner, 24/7, 365, or 366 if it's a leap year. This is History Hefner here to answer all of your questions on our second live stream of the weekend, which is always the part 2 of our Q&A, Ask Me Anything. We had a fun live stream yesterday, and because it's a 3-day weekend, we moved forward everything, so we will be doing our live stream lecture tomorrow at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, where we will be talking about the history of Memorial Day and explaining how that holiday works, where its origin comes from, what war started the tradition of Memorial Day, which is a very American holiday. So we'll be discussing some American history there. So please join us for a Memorial Day special where I talk about the history of Memorial Day, and that's at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time tomorrow. Looking forward to that. You all can check out my long-form video on Memorial Day to learn the history of that important holiday, which I will be re-uploading tomorrow at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So I hope you guys really, really enjoy that. And hello, Hars, my wonderful moderator, is here to hold down the chat. And for the next hour or so, I will be answering all of your questions related to history and social studies. If you enjoy that topic, you enjoy what the smoking jacket I'm wearing, 19th century style, given to me by a Patreon and a longtime friendly neighborhood historian. We've been at this for over a year, so long time means over a year. Consider liking and subscribing if you like history, the sound of my voice, what I'm wearing, what we're talking about, or the good vibes we have going on in our chat and all of that. This is the Friendly Neighborhood History channel where we bring you history in a friendly, neighborly manner. So consider liking and subscribing and perhaps becoming a member, joining, donating, helping us. Anything helps as we continue to grow and expand and to update our technology and what we're using here in the channel to make this experience as amazing as it possibly can be for all of you. And this is History Hefner here to answer all of your questions related to history and social studies for the next hour or so. And our live stream lecture is usually today at this time, Sundays at 4 p.m. Eastern, but it's tomorrow as a Memorial Day special, 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, where I will tell you the story of one of America's military holidays or commemorations or celebrations, Memorial Day. So, looking forward to that. We usually do live streams every Friday and Saturday at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, where I answer all of your questions related to history and social studies, but we moved everything back. So today is our second Q&A of the weekend. Usually that's on Saturdays. But anyways, so this is the Friendly Neighborhood History channel. Consider liking and subscribing. And Hars already has a question in the chat. Can you explain greenbacks during the U.S. Civil War? Greenbacks were the counterpart to Confederate currency. Confederate currency has become a rare item, which basically became famous for losing all of its value near the end of the war as the Confederate economy collapsed because of the Union using their ironclad warships, which they had a lot more than the Confederacy did, to blockade southern ports and basically starve the Confederates out. Blockades have a unique and underappreciated value in warfare. In Constantinople, the Ottomans used them to destroy the Byzantine Empire. The British used it to starve out the Germans and to assert their naval dominance during the Great War, what you call World War I, and I consider to be World War II. And during the Civil War, it was no less the case. So greenbacks were Union-issued currency, similar to, I think they were similar in some ways to T-bills, Treasury bills, those sorts of things that are bonds that were used to support the Union war effort, but they were government-issued currency during the Civil War. And hello, Katie. Devin is asking, can you explain to me if God has been prevalent in man's life ever since the beginning of time with Adam and Eve? Then why is there no mention of God until 3,000 years ago? There is, when you consider written down text, human beings have been writing their experiences for 6,000 years and documenting them archaeologically. There are experiences of mankind with the divine that date back to ancient archaeology and ancient depictions. Written traditions are much less prevalent in the ancient world as opposed to oral tradition. Many ancient writings and texts have been lost over time, and those include writings about the divine and different religious texts that are no longer extant, probably. At the same time, early religious traditions begin based on oral tradition and things like that. And that is very common in Africa, and it's very common in the Middle East, where much of humanity originated and where many of its traditions, cultures, and religions came from. The Bible, the Vedas, many of the scriptures that are used in many of the most sacred religions started off as oral traditions, with paper copies of them coming much later. It was much harder to print and maintain ancient texts in the ancient world, obviously, than it has been in the modern world. With the advent of the printing press in 1447, Johannes Gutenberg made a point by printing the first text being the Bible after he had created his printing press. So Devin, very good question, but basically, as long as humanity has existed, existed. Religion has seemingly played a part, regardless of what culture or society it is. Queries about the divine, the afterlife, and why the world functions and works the way it does have been prevalent in every civilization and culture. And hello, Sirvana. Welcome to the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel. I do not watch WWII, but I'm happy to welcome a fan here. Angela, hello. Nitish, I am good. I hope you are well. What was the primary cause of the Chicago Haymarket Affair of 1893? The Haymarket riots were a series of different riots carried out by labor groups that were demanding more justice, cleaner workplaces, all of the different things. And because of the calls for better sanitation, workers' rights, better wages, lower hours, the end of child labor, these parts of the labor movement were basically crushed by became quite riotous. Workers went on strike. They tried to disrupt businesses and manufacturing, and the Chicago police got involved, and violence erupted, leading to a violent riot where several people were killed. So, yeah. But hopefully that answers your question. Good luck with that. Please explain Indian politics and culture. Well, I can't explain all of it, Nitish, but I would be happy to answer that for you. We love talking about India and its history and its culture there. Indian politics right now is in a storm of nationalism, with Prime Minister Modi wanting to rename the country, give it its ancient name of Bharat, which is a Sanskrit word, and abandon India. India refers to the Indus River Valley, which is the most ancient civilization in the Indian subcontinent. For those of you who don't know, by the way, the Indian subcontinent is India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, all of those areas. It's not just the country of India. Because the Indus River Valley and that civilization is actually in Pakistan, the bulk of it, the Indians, who have obviously a lot of dissension from the Pakistanis because India is a Hindu majority country, divided from Pakistan, a Muslim majority country, by the British in 1947 when they decolonized the area. There is a movement amongst Indian nationalists to get away from any reference or affiliation with Pakistan, and that includes the ancient name of India, or the ancient civilization that first started the subcontinent of India, the Indus River people, who were around 2,500 years before the birth of Christ. So there you go, Nitish. There's a little bit of Indian politics and history for you, and culture. Obviously, there's so much more than that, but India is an extraordinarily brilliant and beautiful civilization with a lot of great history to it. When it comes to Indian culture, the development of the culture of what was called Hindustan for a long time, the land of the Hindus, stan meaning the land of, India obviously majored in having Hinduism as its leading cornerstone. Societies, the caste system, all of the social networking, the arranged marriages, all the things that are stereotypical and traditional to Indian culture that many people in the West may know something about, comes from the Vedas, from the development of Jainism and the development of Hinduism, the world's oldest religion. So, yep, Nitish, I hope you appreciate that. And Mahatma Gandhi, Mohandas was his name. Mahatma was the title. I believe it means something about peaceful one. He was an Indian man who was trained in British education and was fervently in favor of decolonization, and rather than start riots and rebellions like had been the habit of many Indian people in the 20th century with the Indian National Congress, when Gandhi took a hold of it, he employed ideas of civil disobedience, peaceful resistance, coexistence, hunger strikes, and peaceful demonstrations to gain not only sympathy but attention to his cause, and eventually he became the prime mover in getting India independence from the British, which also included Pakistan, Bangladesh, and the end of British control of the Indian subcontinent and Burma in the late 1940s. What is the Roosevelt Colliery? Harsonet is asking. The Roosevelt Colliery is the addition of President Theodore Roosevelt to the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was written in the 1820s by President James Monroe. It was actually written by his Secretary of State, the future president and son of a former president, John Quincy Adams. But basically, the Monroe Doctrine said that the Western Hemisphere was no longer open for colonization by any European power. It was the first time that the United States spoke on behalf of all of the Western Hemisphere, showing the beginnings of what would become its hegemonic influence over the Western world. The Roosevelt Corollary was added when the president was asked to justify him supporting a revolution in Panama to create the Panama Canal and overthrow Colombia, which had controlled Panama. Basically, Panamanian society and the country of Panama was created by U.S. foreign policy interfering there. And it was Roosevelt's justification that the United States not only preserve the Western world from being colonized, but help it self-determine and develop its own systems of governments, which would become a huge part of American foreign policy throughout the 20th century. During the Cold War, which started about 45 years after the Roosevelt corollary, the Soviet Union was intent on spreading communism to Latin and Central and South America, and the United States interfered in many occasions to either maintain dictatorships or depose dictatorships, hoping to maintain anti-communist dictatorships like Manuel Noriega, Augusto Pinochet, Juan Perón, and others, and dissemble communist dictatorships such as Fidel Castro in Cuba. So there's an example of that. Or the Sandinistas under Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua in the 1980s. What was better in your opinion, big stick diplomacy or dollar diplomacy? And explain each. Big stick diplomacy was also Theodore Roosevelt's idea that the United States would only be able to win its diplomatic issues if it showed military strength. And this is where he comes up with the idea of speak softly and carry a big stick. Basically, always be ready to negotiate and work for peace, but make sure that you have a military and a navy in particular to back it up, to show that you will be willing to fight and you have teeth in the game and you can back up your promises with military intervention if possible. It became the cornerstone of conservative foreign policy in the United States, basically called peace through strength. Basically, flexing your own militaristic muscles keeps enemies at bay and friends reassured. It was revamped by George W. Bush and Ronald Reagan during the Cold War, obviously used it, and President Trump seems to have his own variation on that. So it's basically the United States saying that it's a militarily strong country. It's going to use its military strength to intimidate its opponents if necessary. Dollar diplomacy was used by Roosevelt's successor, William Howard Taft, to basically encourage nations around the world to work with the United States through monetary intervention. So modern American foreign policy over the last 40 years has been a combination of a development of dollar diplomacy and big stick diplomacy, where the United States flexes its militaristic muscles, sometimes obviously to horrifying results, such as in Iraq and Afghanistan, but also using that to persuade their allies to do what they want and pursue similar foreign policy aims and political ideas. It also has used dollar diplomacy to influence economies around the world, although dollar diplomacy never developed the way President Taft wanted it to. It was usually used in Latin America by basically saying, we will invest in this if you do this for us. Both of them are a series of quid pro quos for foreign policy. Why do you think that blacks feel that they are more victimized and held back by systematic racism compared to the people in the 60s? Is it culture? Is it the downfall of the father in the black home? These are issues that are constantly at the heart of American sociological issues, and obviously they're extremely important to talk about at any time. Today is the 5th anniversary of when George Floyd was killed by Derek Chauvin. While in police custody, Floyd was dying from a fentanyl overdose and was put in a chokehold where he suffocated under Chauvin's hold, and that obviously became one of the most controversial things of 2020. That, combined with the pandemic and the election, made 2020 one of the most difficult years in recent memory for many people, not just in the United States, but throughout the world. It sparked a number of race riots and political debates surrounding that, and a common conservative retort to questions of systematic oppression, white supremacy, and things like that are that African Americans have had cultural problems such as fatherlessness that have impacted them more than racism in the last 60 years. There definitely has been a decline in overt forms of racism since the civil rights legislation. Obviously, approval for interracial marriages, interracial families, biraciality has skyrocketed. Integration has become much more common, although people continually choose or have no choice to live in segregated neighborhoods due to socioeconomic status, not because of political laws like Jim Crow. Basically, Devin, to answer your question, cultural developments obviously have a huge part to play in how a certain sociological group interacts. There have been progress, but there's still a lot of questions regarding what that progress actually looks like, and if racism racism can't go away, so has it shifted the way it functions in American society? And WWE, you certainly can have my brain as soon as I have your subscription, your knowledge about WWE and stuff like that. I don't know a huge amount about soil houses. I believe that was those are ancient forms of housing used in India. There have been many different civilizations and empires in India: the Mauryan, the Gupta, the Chandragupta. These different empires. The Harappan were the first organized kingdom in the Indian subcontinent. I don't know. I'm going to go with Terry Yartz because that sounds a lot cooler. Dark Knight, I am actually not reading it, but I feel eloquent today, so thank you for that. Prafa, hello. How do you know so much? I read, I study, I bask in history. And Harry's here. Hello, Harry. Good to see you. Have you seen how Prince Albert helped resolve the Trent affair? I've heard a little bit about that. I don't know what that is off the top of my head. Have you read this? Have you read 1776 by David McCullough? No, but I would like to read it. So please join, subscribe, do all of that stuff. Help me stay monetized. Give me and hopefully by getting members to donate and gaining perks, early access, things like that, I can afford to get some David McCullough books. And hello, J-Man. Good to see you. So anyways, this is the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel, and if you enjoy what we're talking about today, consider liking and subscribing and joining and becoming a member. You can get certain perks and benefits such as early releases, members-only chats, and members-only live streams, or you can ask certain questions and get certain perks and attention and shout-outs and videos, early release and early content, extra content, all of that great stuff. When you become a member, you can do that here or on Patreon, where you can check out my series on the First Ladies. I have a series here on the U.S. presidents. And hello, Simon. Why did you call Hitler psychopath? I mean, who wouldn't call Hitler a psychopath? I mean, it's an obvious thing. By the end of the war, what you call the Second World War, what I consider to be World War III, Hitler's mania about winning the war and making costly and rushed, impulsive military decisions cost the Germans immensely. For instance, the D-Day campaign, most of the German high command believed the Allies would land at Normandy and not Calais. Calais is the closest point across the English Channel, but Hitler was assured to refortify Calais and not the Normandy coast. And the D-Day invasion led to the Normandy campaign and probably was the actual spot of the Allied invasion. And Hitler was convinced by Patton's decoy army that the Allies intended to attack Calais and not Normandy. So decisions like that, unilateral decisions, overlooking the wisdom of a high command, leading to disloyalty, like Rommel, who actually tried to kill him and Hitler forced him to take his own life because of that. The invasion of Russia, things like this were big missteps in Hitler's gravy train. He had been successful for quite some time in making strong, brave decisions, full of aggression and anger, but these all cost him horribly. I'm from the United States. I don't get more into detail about that, Simon, but thank you for joining us at the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel. Harry is saying, so Queen Victoria's received a letter from the government, wanted her to say to the U.S. government, and he rewrote the letter in communication. He kept all of our strength and authority, but let the U.S. keep face and bear strength. Yeah, Albert was an incredibly brilliant politician. He had a knack for creativity. He basically helped create the World Fair systems and exhibitions where new inventions, discoveries, and cultural exchange was common in the West, like the Chicago's World Fair, St. Louis. All of these cities hosted incredible fairs with new inventions and discoveries in the late 19th and early 20th century, and Albert was the backbone of a London exhibit in the 1850s. I mean, he was a brilliant and incredibly talented man, and him and Victoria shared probably the greatest love story, at least in modern royal history, if you actually study how close Albert and Victoria were. And when he died, she went into a deep depression that kept her out of public life for almost a decade. So that's a really fascinating thing. NASA and Biden agreed the number one goal of Artemis was to put a non-white, non-male on the moon. That goes against Trump's anti-DEI policy, yet it got a high priority in the 2026 budget. Why? I think the Trump administration does have an imperialistic notion of using NASA to basically put Americans back in space, back on the moon, eventually on Mars and stuff like that. And they just don't want to do it with necessarily DEI stuff. I mean, putting a woman on the moon would be a fantastic accomplishment. The Russians beat the United States to putting a woman and man in space. So the United States would like to outdo them in that way, in kind of a retroactive victory. Did Hitler want to team up with UK prior to Poland invasion? Hitler and many of the Nazis had a great respect for the British Empire. Hitler this is what I mean by psychopathic and militaristic. Hitler had a strong respect for any militancy that he could see. He loved Mussolini because of Mussolini and the fascist ethos of militancy. He supported Francisco Franco for the same reasons in Spain, even though Franco did not return the favor during the war. He hated communism because he thought communism was evil. It was obviously part of a Nazi agenda, and many communists died in the camps during the Shoah or the Holocaust. But Hitler worked with Stalin to split control of Poland. He knew what language Stalin spoke. So Hitler respected anyone with militancy and bravado. And the British had the largest empire in the world with the greatest navy in the world. And so Hitler was obviously extremely respectful of that. And I got in trouble here on YouTube. I got a video removed because I simply said the Nazis would have let Great Britain go and have its empire if they had made certain concessions and dropped out of the war in 1940, which wasn't praising the Nazis, but I was accused of being a white supremacist. So, how did early American industrialization impact the United States around 1840s to 1860s? Obviously, the development of the factory and train system, especially in the North, allowed greater access to Western territories. It also helped develop manufacturing and build wealth in the North. It provided factories and job opportunities for the many immigrants coming, mainly from Ireland at that time. And more than anything, it allowed for the mass productivity that was necessary for the weapons and ammunition of the Union Army during the Civil War. The more populous northern areas, particularly the immigrant areas, were stridently anti-slavery and stridently pro-union during the war. What was Woodstock? Woodstock was a concert. It wasn't one. It was a series of different concerts held at Yesgar's farm in upstate New York in 1969 or 70, and it was basically many of the youthful generation, baby boomers, hippies. Many of them were derisively called, who were celebrating different types of music, folk and rock and roll music. Jimi Hendrix, I think Janis Joplin was there. I'm trying to remember who else, and celebrating the anti-war movement, the free speech movement, basically trying to show the peace and love message of the hippies that had been popular throughout the 60s with the younger crowd. But the miss so much time together. Rest in peace, Prince Albert and Queen Victoria. Yes, a beautiful couple. Today is her birthday, by the way, 1819, May 25th, 1819. So I will be re-uploading my video. I will be sharing my video with about Queen Victoria and her life. Please go check that out. Hitler had a respect for the British, partly because of their empire, but partly because many Germans respected the English. I mean, the English and the Germans share a lot in common. They share a lot of the same stories and legends and mythologies because of the influence of the Anglo-Saxons, who were northern German barbaric groups that invaded and settled England in the 5th century. They shared many of the Norse mythologies, Anglo-Saxon mythology. Oerster, the goddess of fertility, which is the basis of the name Easter, was a Anglo-Saxon and German mythological figure that was transferred to the English. Obviously, the English language, although heavily influenced by French and Latin, is a derivative of Celtic and German tongues. So, yes, there's a lot of commonality between the English and the Germans. Explain. India politics, tourist attack in Kashmir. Were the Indians attacking the tourists? I don't know exactly what you mean by that. I mean, Kashmir has been highly contested for 8 decades, and obviously there was a war fought there in the 1970s that was far more brutal than the recent melee there. When do you think Britain stopped being the world power, and when did it stop being in the big boys club? I would still argue that Britain, because of its cultural and historical influence, is still in the big boys club. I mean, it's part of the G7, it's part of the UN Security Council. Britain, in many ways, has the big boy, but it has big boy pants on with permission from the United States. And I would say that after the 1950s is a huge mark for that. I think 1956, the Suez Canal, where the British and French tried to reassert their dominance over their former colony, and the United States made them stop, is a huge turning point for understanding that the French and British empires were toast, according to American foreign policy, which was the dominant form of foreign policy in the Western world at the time because of the fear of communism and the Cold War going on. So I'd say the British Empire was probably lost its status as the premier world power, but It's hard. I would. It's easily. I think the United States comes up to tie after the first, or what you call the first, I call the Second World War. So 1919 is obviously an example of that. But the British Empire expanded and by 1921 had greater influence than it ever had before. And then I would say again, 1945, obviously at the end of the war, the United States takes the lead. And I think 1956, the British really recede from there on because it becomes obvious that the United States is not going to settle for anything but the decolonization of Africa, where the bulk of England's colonies still were. Why does 1% of the richest families control 99% of the wealth and power? It's an exaggeration to be sure about that, but they're obviously, this is what's called the Pareto principle. 20% of the people will own 80% of the wealth, machinery, and goods, and it's like that in any society. Why did the British make bad military decisions during the US Revolution? I think they felt that it would have been easy and it was kid gloves, and I think a lot of things were intuitive to them, but the American revolutionaries fought extremely counterintuitively. Look at the Green Mountain Boys, look at Daniel Morgan, and look at how the South, full of loyalists, turned against the British as the war went on. Cart Como, great question. I don't think I've seen you before, so welcome. What was the Treaty of Westphalia? It established the modern nation state, where basically a group of people living in a single area would consider themselves an individual country. It ended most of the Protestant Catholic religious wars. If you want to learn more about those, go back to my live stream lecture from last Sunday where I talk about that. But 1648 established the nation state and ends the 30 Years' War and basically nonstop fighting on the European continent that had been going on for 3 decades. And actually 8 decades when you throw in that the Spanish and Dutch have been fighting since 1568, the 80 Years' War. Because America really wasn't that important compared to Caribbean, South Africa, and India. They didn't have as full of, they had Jamaica, they had parts of India, the British East India Company was still over that, and Canada was became the real gem. And to replace their colonial influence there, they redirected their attentions to Australia. It is extraordinarily easy for you to say that a nation with so much resources and unmitigated power like the United States just was cut loose by the British. That's an argument I've heard. It's not a correct one. Why was the U.S. so interested in what we were doing in Egypt? It was a decolonization effort, and the idea of nationalizing the Suez Canal, when the British, French, and Israelis refused to allow that to happen, reeked of post-colonial imperialism, and the United States didn't want that to be thrown in their face by the Soviets because the common Cold War policy was that the U.S. would favor the self-determination and democracy of all different peoples as long as they weren't communists. And to keep Nasser, Gamal Abdel Nasser, the leader of the Egyptian military and basically the president dictator of Egypt, from falling in with the Soviets and giving Egypt, one of the most populous and resourceful countries in the Middle East and Africa, into the communist hands, the United States tried to appease him by letting him take control of the Suez Canal. Thank you so much. This is a smoking jacket. It is a popular form of dressing gown from the 19th century. Do you think the Anglo-American Empire is coming to an end? There seems to be a decline in that. I mean, just the birth rates alone, no empire is doing well when its birth rate slip below replacement rate. When a country is getting older before it is being repopulated, there's a problem there. It's happened to Japan and South Korea. It's happening to the United States and Great Britain and Canada, so that's the Anglo world by and large in the West. Why was Britain seriously considering assisting the Confederates in the U.S. Civil War? Great question. They weren't ostensibly supportive of slavery, but they relied on the cash crop cotton. Cotton was king. And so they knew that if the South failed, their textile industry would really suffer, and they relied on the imports. So Lincoln did everything he could, even blocking some of their diplomatic ships, in order to keep the British from supporting the Confederacy. Yeah. But the U.S., Harry, refused to tolerate the French and the British fighting to control the Suez Canal. And hello, Justin. Thank you for joining us. And Rodolfo, great to see you. So we've got 4 of my moderators here. Or 3, Horace, Rodolfo, and Harry. Thank you for joining us. This is the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel. If you're enjoying what you're learning about and you'd like the history that I'm talking about, consider liking and subscribing and dropping a topic, comment, or question in the chat that I will answer in a timely manner. We've got a light crowd here, but it's an enjoyable one. We've got some good questions and everything, and it's really nice to see. So, the U.S. had no right to stop us talking to the Confederacy. What Lincoln did that was brilliant was create the Emancipation Proclamation to make the war about slavery, to tell Britain and France, if you're doing this, you're supporting slavery, which was the undergirding truth of the war anyways. Well, the U.S. was fighting a war, and they were trying to keep the English out of it, so they were in desperate times. Does His Majesty King Charles III being the head of the Commonwealth give England more status? It gives England a level of international prestige, but I mean, everybody knows that the British monarch is a figurehead. How do you think the immigration redistribution in the United States is going to affect the demographics and political views of different parts of the nation? This is a common view by a lot of right-wingers and neo-nationalists. I'm not saying neo-Nazis, I said neo-nationalists. People like Tucker Carlson and many of the people who have the ear of President Trump. Basically, the idea is that immigrants who come to this country, it doesn't even matter their race necessarily, but they come to replace native people who have jobs, and they're also replacing their political voices. That basically, some on the right feel that the Democratic Party is replenishing its dwindling numbers with minorities, which was seen badly in the last election. The Democratic Party has a large amount of support from African American and Hispanic communities. That is shifting now, and shifting in a big way. The hope, according to this theory, is that new immigrants will receive amnesty, even if they cross the border illegally or without papers or overstay their visas, and because of that, they will be grateful to the party that granted them that legal status, and they will vote Democratic, giving demographic power to the Democrats in certain areas. Congressional redistricting every decade through the census, the counting of the population, means that that where the immigrants go, and once they become citizens, they can be counted in the census, and that state will get more House representatives, and those people will already be voting Democratic because the Democrats gave them amnesty, and they will vote for Democrats, and the Democrats will gain political power in Congress, in the House and the Senate, because everyone in a state votes for their senator. So yeah, those are some things. What's your opinion? Salam to you, Hulaya. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. What's your opinion on U.S. current gun laws compared to past laws? The U.S. it's interesting because most of the Western world does not struggle with the gun control issue nearly as much as the United States does. The United States is far more conservative on guns in the sense of allowing them, gun rights, than Australia, Great Britain, many of the areas. So, and there seems to be this push and pull, and the United States uses its subsidiarity, where a lot of the power that is not explicitly given by the government is turned over to the states to allow certain states the rights to either allow to interpret the Second Amendment the way they want, the right to bear arms. So some states interpret that extraordinarily strictly, and some states do not. Well, the British monarch does have a lot of paper authority, but they can't exercise that authority. Yes, and everybody knows it. It's an open secret. Isn't immigration needed with a dwindling birth rate? Yes, Carlos, but I don't necessarily, it's a sociological replacement theory of dwindling birth rates for countries struggling with natalism. China may be forced to this, but when you take 400 people from one country and you take 10 of them and put them in a country that is at 390, then one country has 400 and one country has 390. It's not birthing new people. Yes, they will have new families and stuff, and they tend to be on the poorer socioeconomic platforms. Some of them do. And poorer people tend to have less access to healthcare and birth control, meaning that they'll have more children, but that isn't a necessary catch-all, and meanwhile, their native countries and their population dwindles. So it doesn't solve the natal crisis, it just pushes the goalposts back. Do you think the U.S. should reverse the 17th Amendment and scrap the Second Amendment? No, I don't think they should scrap the Second Amendment, because without the Second Amendment, there would be no United States. Or at least, well, that's an anachronistically bad argument. The founders understood that the Second Amendment was there, that they had won their independence through a militia that was well regulated and well armed, and that had been made up of individuals who were willing to use their weapons to fight British soldiers, and those guerrilla tactics had indeed been successful. So, fearing the rise of what they considered to be a tyrannical government, they would do everything in their power to maintain the people's right to do that. The 17th Amendment is, I believe, is that direct election of senators? I think it makes America more democratic than a republic, and that wasn't the original intention. I think it should be out to interpretation, and I think maybe states should decide whether or not they want direct election of senators. It used to be legislators could allow that. Yes, and a lot of people in the United States think 2 years is insane. The burden of proof is to show that 30 minutes is insane, and the burden of proof would also be to show that 2 years is insane. And yes, I'm talking about the USA, but I answer questions related to history of all types. We've been talking about Indian history. We talked about the World War III, or what you talked about, a lot of great history today. Hello, Pot. Great to see you. With the death of the fiat dollar, do you think we will go back to a gold standard as a form of money? No, I think cryptocurrency is on the rise. I don't know if we'll ever have a crypto or Bitcoin currency standard, but I think that we're not just going to go back to a brick and mortar form of currency. But yes, fiat currency is on the decline because the almighty U.S. dollar, which is the gold standard, no pun intended, of the world economy, and is the reserve currency for the globe, lost its high credit rating and is losing its value. And the only thing that is supporting it is itself. It is resting on its own laurels and its own reputation to provide value, and that is not sustainable. Any society that does that devalues its currency and then disintegrates. The Yuan dynasty in China and the Roman Empire had this happen to them. The reason they created paper currency was so that they would not devalue currencies. It's what the Song dynasty did in the 12th century. 2 years is perfectly reasonable, and having regulations and interviews and references is perfectly reasonable. It's not a job. Buying a gun because you're angry and having no regulations on who can buy the gun and when is absolute insanity. The founders disagreed with you, and they didn't buy. They bought guns, but they also made guns and stuff like that. The pushback you would probably get from a lot of gun rights activists, I understand where you're coming from, Harry, is the problem is you have hundreds of millions of guns in this country, and you have relatively little gun crime compared to that. Whereas countries without gun crime tend to have violent crime more disproportionately. The only regulation is you have an ID and there is background checks in almost every state. There is clearances, and people can leave guns in many states the same day that they get them, which is odd to me. But I think, Harry, it's offensive to my American sensibilities to wait that long, and it's offensive to your British sensibilities. It's showing a cultural bias that you and I both have. I'm used to it. You're not. That's why we think the way we do, probably. I'm not saying I disagree with you, by the way. I don't usually share my political perspectives. I'm saying why the amendment is there historically and what historically has been the case. The British Constitution, the British Bill of Rights, does make some room for the allowance of the British citizenry to have weapons and have firearms, but there is obviously a lot more room for regulation than the Second Amendment, which is the almighty dollar for the gun rights activists. Yes, the 17th Amendment is the direct election of senators, and it is unpopular with a lot of people who believe America should be a more Republican, not with a lowercase r, than a more democratic society where state legislatures chose senators rather than the people directly. The people would vote for those legislators who would then vote for their senators. Those legislatures also began the process of voting for the presidential electors, and popular vote came later. So popular vote to determine the electors from a certain state going to a winner of that state's popular vote to determine the president is an indirect form of democracy that didn't exist when America first started. It's like you call a liquid gas. It's stupid. I don't. With the update of AI, do you think mass unemployment is on the horizon? There's always this shifting question of automation, and I don't want to side with the Luddites who felt that factories would put people out of work. I think there's a change and an adjustment, and sure, many will lose their jobs, but that is what happens as an economy develops. An economy starts off as provincial and agricultural, then it tends to become industrialized and manufacturing. These are with many, many different checkpoints and milestones along the way. And then one of the later stages of that is it goes from produce to a productive economy to a service economy, and now the United States and much of the Western world is in the phases of being a digital economy, and AI would be part of that. Yes, that's true, Blue Baron. Very true. So, good evening, Freshly. Blue Baron, great to see you. Carlos, thank you for joining us. It's great to see so many friendly neighborhood historians here. Remember to like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. And ask a question, drop a topic or a comment you would like to discuss in the chat. I will be happy to answer it on this wonderful Sunday afternoon that I get to share with you talking about history. This is the Q&A we would usually do on Saturday, but we weren't able to be here on Friday, so we've had back-to-back Q&As, Ask Me Anything. And we will be back tomorrow for my usual live stream lecture at 6 p.m. Eastern, where I will be lecturing on the history of Memorial Day. Oh yeah, that's true. Americans have, I mean, I like, you go to hospital, not the hospital. I like lift more than elevator. I like a lot of British terms. I'm an Anglophile myself. Hello, welcome to the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel. We'll have to start paying people a wage to do nothing eventually. Universal basic income, UBI, is on the rise because of automation. And there's a huge argument surrounding that. It's difficult to have basically giving people money without something in exchange that produces value that is exchanged. That's hard to do in economies. What do you think of the Tartarian history? Are you referring to the Tatars, the group of Turkish raiders who were used by the Mongols to basically keep the Muscovites under wraps in the 14th and 15th centuries? Because I don't know a huge amount about them. Basically, they took over the remnants of this Central Eurasian empire called the Golden Horde, which was a khanate, a Mongol kingdom that operated in Central Asia, modern-day Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and of course Kazakhstan, and dominated the Muscovites, who were the Russians, and when they were called Muscovy, basically grinding them under, putting a boot on their face for 250 years almost. And then in 1480, the Russians stopped paying tribute to the Mongols, the Golden Horde stopped fighting with them, and for centuries the Tatars continued to be one of the Russians' greatest foes, and everything. Tell me the history of India. So we talk a lot about that. India originally started with the Indus River Valley in that civilization about 2,500 years BC, and that is why it is called India. That is why the Indians today want to change the name to Bharat, because the Indus River Valley is in Pakistan. The first major civilization in that subcontinent is in Pakistan. Yep. Do you think the U.S. is the greatest country in the world, considering the world and the number of adults that believe angels are real? I mean, that's like saying because someone believes something that isn't necessarily provable, their population is stupid and their country is not great. That's not necessarily fair. I mean, yes. Oh, I see what you're saying. Yes, there is. So the United States has this locus of being the greatest nation on the earth, but it is never qualified by the many problems. The disproportionate amount of the criminal population, the numbers of guns per individual is not necessarily a bad thing, by the way, Harry, when you consider the fact that the overwhelmingly vast majority of those guns are never used on a person. It's the assumption that the gun means violence that a lot of Americans would push back at. So I think the U.S. obviously has a claim to fame and has a lot that it's riding on, but when it comes to foreign policy, it's riding on coattails that are about 75 to 80 years old. It has had a number of misses when it comes to Vietnam and the Iraq War and Afghanistan. I think economically and societally, America's education system is struggling a lot. Economically, there is a lot of prosperity. There is a reason that the United States takes in more refugees and immigrants than any other country, and that's just legal, let alone illegal. There is a reason that a large portion of the world's population wants to come to the United States. There are obviously advantages, dreamscapes, and perks to being an American as opposed to living in other places of the world. But that doesn't, and it would be hard to say who exactly is the greatest based on the size, scope, and diversity of the United States. But there are countries that are definitely challenging the U.S. hegemony over world affairs, and China would be one of them with its recent rise. And there are countries in Europe that have more thorough social safety nets for their people, and better educational systems. East Asia has had better educational systems for quite some time, and these obviously challenge any notion that the United States is alone the greatest or can be easily declared the greatest without qualification. So there you go. Do you think the Polish played a big part in defending Europe against the Mongolians? Yes, they did. I mean, it was Prince Nevsky, but that's the Lithuanians who defeated the large Mongols, and he's a hero to the Russians too, the large Mongol forces. But basically, the Mongols got into Central Europe and probably would have been able to conquer most of Europe, but then with the death of, I think it was Mogadai Khan, the son of Genghis Khan, that caused a Kurultai, where the Mongol leaders all had to pull back their armies and meet in Mongolia to decide on their next Khaganate, the leader of the Khans. And that was and that changed history because they kind of pulled out of Europe, and the furthest west they ever got was really Russia. Does the world economy have enough energy resources to be sustainable for future growth? It all depends on the development of nuclear energy like the French use, and it depends on how quick solar panels, which are becoming more and more efficient, and renewable sources of energy become highly utilized, highly efficient, and completely safe. Years ago, Australian computerized many of their drive-through food places. Yes, that's happened in many places. Yes, thank you, YouTube. I appreciate you warning us. This is, Harry, I love that question. Do you think I love most of your questions, but do you think the EU needs the UK and the UK needs the EU? I was going to make a historical hot take and say that England is not European. That would land me in a lot of trouble. I don't know if what you would think about that, Harry, but Great Britain, England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, throughout its history, those two large islands and all of the subsidiary small islands like the Isle of Man and Isle of Wight have been trying to decide if it is European for 2,000 years. Conquered by the Romans, obviously in that sphere of influence, do not have a firmly based Latin-based language, but obviously share the religious and cultural background of the Europeans. The British and the English have decided when they want to be continental Europeans and when they don't, based on what interests them. After the Napoleonic Wars in the 1810s, the British left most of Europe to its own devices to go and use their massive navy, which was built because of their status as an island nation, to overwhelm other parts of the world and colonize them, such as Africa, India, and Australia. So, or large sections of Africa, not all of Africa. The French took a huge amount of West Africa, for instance. But the truth of the matter is, Harry, the British continue to do this back and forth of how European they are, at least when it comes to being how continentally European they are. They are not part of the continent proper, but how much they want to be involved in that continental process. So they participate in the ECE, they don't participate in the EU, but they've never found a proper way to leave the EU. So I do think that it would be France as the predominant power in Europe after that. I think that the EU does need the UK, and the UK does need the EU to some extent at this point. What is your say on the politics happening in South Africa? I'm still trying to figure out the genocide situation. Thank you for answering that. That's a really good, and thank you, YouTube, MorningBot. I always appreciate it. Talk about automation. Make sure to subscribe, MorningBot. But yes, so this is obviously the big news story. South Africa is struggling with its white population. There are many different cultural and historical contexts that must be understood before we can actually talk about what is happening currently. The animus between native South African peoples and the Afrikaans, who are the descendants of Dutch and English, but primarily Dutch people who own large-scale farms and produce the vast majority of crops, which means their emigration, leaving a country, immigration with an E, not an I, from there to the United States will drastically hurt South Africa and could cause famine, unless those farms are properly utilized by the native African people in South Africa. But they produce like 90% of most of the crops, if you look at the stats. Basically, because of a legacy of apartheid was a system developed by the Dutch after the British left South Africa to self-governance in the 1930s and then fully left in the 1960s. The Dutch developed a system of apartheid where they kept the majority population, the South African natives, basically in political, social, and economic segregation, depriving them of proper resources, education, and political opportunities. This was eventually overthrown by the efforts of Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress, which I've talked about a lot on this, who partly inspired by militaristic actions by Spear of a Nation, and also partly inspired by the peaceful demonstrations of Gandhi, who I talked about earlier on this live stream, developed as and the help of some white South Africans who turned against that, embraced their South African natives. The apartheid system was overthrown. Mandela became president, and the country began to heal. It has large amounts of resources, diamonds, but it also has a lot of farmland. It has a lot of economic and social opportunity and clout, and is one of the politically strongest and most stable countries in all of the African continent. And therefore, many people see it as the future leader of Africa in many, many ways, or the future powerful, predominant country, like the United States in many ways is the predominant country in North America. So the animus but just because all of that stopped doesn't mean that the wounds of the past or the systems of the past are so easily thrown apart. So there is a constant theme of anger and resentment and frustration because of the economic and social lot of many native Africans in South Africa that have turned them against many of the white farmers who continue to own huge portions of the land and produce huge portions of the crops and are usually very wealthy because of this. This has led to a lot of animosity from many sectors of the South African government and society, who in the most recent years has tried to collectivize farming, seizing land, crops, and wealth from South African whites who don't really like their crops and land being collectivized. Nobody really likes it. Look at the Ukrainians in the 1930s. They certainly didn't like it, and has led to the killing of some of them. Now, they are not disproportionate. Now, this targeting seems to be racial in origin. They are not there is a disproportionate amount of attention towards them. It is not making up a lot in the real numbers because they are such a small portion of the population. But the United States has recently turned its attention there, seeing the South Africans as a real example, in the opinion of the Trump administration, of proper refugee status, rather than the Haitians that were brought here in much larger numbers under the Biden administration, and given protected status, many of them showing up in places like Springfield, Ohio. So the United States has opened the door towards South African refugees coming, white Afrikaans who have lost their land and their livelihood. And so far, about 60 of them have come, which have led many to criticize the Trump administration of racist duplicity and hypocrisy, allowing them to come in, but not Haitians or Venezuelans. The retort to this is obviously that these people are being targeted for what the Trump administration considers to be what the Trump administration considers to be a genocide. Although that hasn't occurred, there is a fear that there is an attempted genocide going on with these people, and that is why they have been welcomed in with refugee status to the United States. So, Disseminatic, that's a large overview of it's much more complex than that, but that's my 1,000-foot overview of that. And obviously the historical and cultural context informs our geopolitics, so I'm not sharing a political perspective. I am giving both sides of the equation and talking about what has objectively happened in the history of South Africa that has led to the Afrikaans fleeing and being targeted by their government. Nobody's hands are clean in this. What do you think about Russification of Northern Asia? I've read somewhere that Novgorod was Finnish ancestry and Crimea, Hunnic Urals, many indigenous, but now all speak Russian. Russia, basically, it's not Northern Asia, it's Eurasia, it's Eastern Europe, a lot of it, but these areas were conquered and integrated by the Muscovites and the Russian Empire as time went on. Russia society itself starts in Ukraine with the Kievan Rus. The Kievan Rus were a series of Vikings. They were called the Varangians, who intermarried with Slavic peoples and formed a series of different principalities that were this loose confederation known as the Kievan Rus. The Kievan Rus were destroyed when the Mongols conquered their land in 1240 under Batu Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, and ever since then. But the Muscovites were the ones who eventually threw off the Mongol yoke in the 1480s, and ever since then have dominated that area. So the Russian people are a combination of Slavic peoples, Finnish people, Nordic peoples, and different types of Eurasian, Turkic peoples, and things like that. So it's not one group of people per se. If you want to learn more, go and watch my series on the Russian Tsars, and I'm doing a current series on Russian history. I do shorts every day on this channel and long-form videos every Monday and Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern. Mughal Empire is an Indian name for Mongol, based on Abu, who was Babur, the founder of it, who was a derivative of the Timurid Empire in Afghanistan and was related to the Mongols. And the Mughal Empire ruled over India until the 19th century, although its collapse in power in the 1700s helped Britain and the British East India Company assume dominance over India, its economy, and eventually its politics. It became part of the British Empire in 1858. Do you think the Constitution is the only thing special about the U.S.? That's one of the special things about the United States. The nation of immigrants claim obviously is a more unique thing that the United States has that many other countries do not have. Let's be fair, the U.S. has had more mass shootings than days this year. So that's an interesting thing. The way they define those is that a mass shooting is 2 or more people being shot. There's many different causalities and situations for that, and that is definitely true. When the numbers are actually adjusted per capita, the United States is not at the top of those shootings. There are many other countries, even some European countries, that have worse results from that. The U.S. 20,000 people murdered by police each year. We have made 11 in the past decade. That's not true, Mary. Those are exaggerated numbers. But You're entitled to your opinion, not your facts. China global reach is still nowhere near that of the USA. That's true, Blue Baron, but it's definitely growing, and the tariffs are not helping U.S. influence, and a lot of people are looking to China anyways as their leader, and the productivity, the rare minerals, the things that the Chinese supply the world with have definitely given it a lot of leverage when it comes to trade, productivity, and economic development. And Flag is asking, how long do you think religion in general is going to run the world? I don't know if religion does run the world. The most advanced societies in world history have shown to be the most secularized societies in human history. The United States is secularizing. Western Europe has secularized. China is very secular. India is very secular. Many of the strong players economically and politically in the world are very thoroughly secularized societies that have left behind many of the confines of their different religious movements from the past. Europe is unrecognizable as a Catholic continent despite being a Catholic continent for 1,000 years. And thank you, Blue Baron. I believe this channel is underrated too. And if you think like Blue Baron, consider liking and subscribing and joining, becoming a member and all of that good stuff. That's our pin message for the day. And I'm going to catch up with the chat. I promise. I don't know a huge amount about the Khazar Empire, but I know that it was brought down by the Russians. They were kind of a leftover remnant of the Golden Horde run by the Tatars. And then they really got whipped by Ivan the Terrible, who highly expanded Russia's power and influence in the 16th century. The only great thing about the USA is money and free speech, and I'm not sure about free speech. Yeah, that's partly true. Yes, I would say that's true, Harry. The British are Europeans, not European citizens. And that's fair. You should read William Dalrymple's book, White Mogul. I would be happy to read it. William Dalrymple. Okay, thank you. Do you think we're on the brink of World War III? In my opinion, World War III already happened, but I don't know if we're on the brink of World War IV. Every time it seems to flare up over the last 5 years, it seems to simmer down. Ukraine-Russia was going to be World War IV, or what they call World War III, because they haven't watched this channel and they don't know that there have been 3 world wars. By the way, I'm not the only historian who believes that, but I am very loud about that belief. But basically, the next World War, then they thought it was Gaza and Israel. Then they thought it was Israel and Lebanon. Then they thought it was India and Pakistan. These conflicts emerge. Not every one of them is going to be a world war. I think we're too gun-ho to jump on this is the next world war. What do you think would happen when Putin leaves power? I don't know. It's hard to picture Russia without Putin at this point. He may lose power if this war comes to an end, which is one of the reasons why he doesn't want it to end. Yeah. Harry, I love your fervor, and you're probably correct about much of what you say, but it's fascinating that it's always someone else's fault and not the British. The Indians starved because of the Japanese, when Churchill could have given them food and didn't. The Americans are bad, and that's why the British Empire doesn't exist anymore. The EU is terrible because of Germany and France. And thank you, I love the robe too. It's a smoking jacket. And to tip my Anglophile hat, it's British in style, brought back from the Crimean War when Turkish tobacco became very popular in British pipes. And we aren't a founding member to help shape the EU. That's true. That sounds like something the French would do. But to be fair, Harry, France and Germany screwing over the British. When has this happened before in human history? Yes, that's true. And most of the 20th century is the German question in Europe. So the geopolitical situation in Europe has always revolved. It's only recently where it hasn't revolved around, does Germany get to exist and what shape is it in? Is it divided? Is it as powerful? The rancorous aggression of both the Nazis and the Kaiser made a lot of people very hesitant to have Germany unified. And if they were unified, they wanted them to be very, very powerless compared to France, Great Britain, and especially the United States. There's a lot of cool things about France, Stephen. Don't say that. I'm a European historian. I've got to be a Francophile as much as I'm an Anglophile. And Napoleon is an incredible figure in history, probably my favorite. But yeah, there's more to it than that. Can you elaborate on Mandela's terroristic connections I've heard of? That is the Spear of the Nation, which, thanks to Shuriken, I actually learned about here on the channel. There's things I've never heard about before I did this channel, before I did these live streams, and you've brought them to my attention. But XYZ, good to see you, by the way. The Spear of a Nation was basically a militant group. Most of its activity, including necklacing, where they would put a tire over someone's head, make them carry it, and then set it on fire, were carried out after Mandela was put in, what's the name of the island? But he was put on. But he was put on an island prison for decades. Then Britain should have been paid reparations after World War II. That process became uncommon after that war, interestingly enough. Did you know Germany only paid off its World War I debt in 2015 to the UK? You mean World War II debt? But yes, that sounds about right. The United States has basically told the British they can't collect on it. That was the Dawes plan. Germany scares me. Only country to go to war with the entire world, almost won twice. I refer you to Norm Macdonald's joke about that. It's hilarious. I do not believe that the penalties of the Germans for the Second World War, for the Great War, caused the Third World War with the Nazis. I've always felt that the Treaty of Versailles did not cause that war. If you look at Germany in the late 20s, it was prosperous, proud, and stable. It was the Great Depression that caused the next war, almost just as much, if not more so, than the Treaty of Versailles. I think the common historiographical understanding is wrong. The Khazars are a group of people who settled in that region. I don't know much more, that Central Eurasian area near where Russia is, part of Russia today, in Kazakhstan, areas like that. Mongols largely let locals keep their local ways over the years. Many Mongols adapted local ways and disappeared into the local populations. That's right, the Ilkhanate in Persia became a Persian empire and adopted Islam. The Yuan dynasty fashioned itself a Chinese imperial dynasty, even during the time of Kublai Khan, who had conquered the Song. Both world wars were not just. It was literally to stop the rise of their exponential growth. Both UK, France, and Russia didn't want that. I don't know about this. I can see that with the Great War. I don't know about that with the Nazis. It's hard for me to convince me, but I appreciate your perspective. William's saying, I don't see why they shouldn't be able to. You can claim asylum for so many reasons. I don't also think it's up to debate, but the South African government has lied about the number of death farms. Yeah. There's a lot of concerns about corruption in South Africa. John, that's not fully true. There were Zulus and different groups of people of Bantu origin who had settled in South Africa, and the Zulus were the most formidable and well-known for their fighting spirit, and they were not happy that the Boers were there. And yes, thank you, William. I appreciate that. Do you think Germany is lucky to exist after losing 2 world wars? Yes. Thank you, John. Well, if you ever get on there, phone me and we can split some of the proceeds. Yeah, the Germans are the most popular race. And look at the barbarians that destroyed the Roman Empire. They were all Germanic. The Alemanni, the Goths, although they weren't originally from Germany, they're very Germanic in their culture and where they settled. Also ancestry, that's true. Do you like Simon Webb, the older guy with the beard? He has a channel called History Debunked. No, but I should check him out. Thank you for the recommendation. You think who will start World War III, World War IV, Iran, Russia, or North Korea? I don't know. I don't know if anyone's going to start it. If my best guess would be Iran, unless Russia invades Poland, which I just don't see them doing because they know that's going to bring down hellfire and they can barely hold off the Ukrainians right now. I would say it would be Iran or Israel. If Israel attacks Iran and Iran retaliates, that could start a world war. By the way, what do you think of Russification of North Africa, of Northern Asia, and Novgorod being finished? Oh, I answered that. I don't know if we ever got there. And Shrukin, you're here too. Yeah. Let me see here. We don't have guns in the UK, but London and Birmingham are very dangerous in parts. Yeah, there is a trade-off. And yes, you have very little gun violence in the UK. You have very little in Australia. You have issues with violent crime rates, however. And you have that in the United States too. Let me see. I'm trying to catch up with the chat. Because only less than 2% of British cops guns, 100% of US cops and their moms have guns. Harry, you're just sounding anti-American. That's just all you're sounding right now. India versus China, India versus Pakistan. India has no affinity for the Chinese, which should reassure the Americans because the Americans are very worried about China's influence. The issue of Tibet has kept India and Pakistan and China on different sides. Let me see. Did Northeast Asians ever try to get to the Americas before the Spanish did? There was something called the Treasure Fleet of Zheng He under the Ming Dynasty, and when the Ming Dynasty pulled back after Zheng He's death, these tributary fleets, these huge flotillas that were supported by strong naval warships that have been going around the South China Sea and much of the Indian Ocean exacting tribute from the different Polynesian and Macronesian societies stopped. If they had kept going, they may have made it all the way to America. I do not know about that diamond, or I'm going to have to take the L on that. The British have let me see, you pick your hands a lot. Do you have OCD or ADHD? No, but I've got a bad mosquito bite on this hand. And yeah, the hand gestures only emphasize what I'm going for. So, you think what will happen in the Middle East? I don't know. It's going to go one of two ways, but it looks more and more like if the U.S. is telling Israel it will not continue to support it, then Israel will have no choice but to stop the war in Gaza, or at least not attack Iran. Nikhil, there's obviously a lot of questions. So most of the Western locus is on supporting India over Pakistan because of Pakistan's history. That was where Osama bin Laden was killed, and there's obviously concerns of Islamic terrorism there. What is your favorite show and movie? Good question. Great to see you in No Way Affiliate. Favorite show. Right now, I'm loving The Blacklist, James Spader. It's absolutely fantastic. Favorite movie? It's tough. I'm just going to go with a historical one, but it's not my favorite historical movie, but it's one of them. I'm going to recommend Braveheart, one everyone's seen, or Schindler's List. The 90s just had a lot of really good historical movies, even if they weren't fully historically accurate. Yeah. 1260 what, Harry? 1260 gun deaths, most of which are suicides, or 1260 deaths from cops? Do you think the Earth's history that is told to us is false and only written by the victors? Part of it is, but I think there's generally a consent there. You can synthesize archaeological, historical, and oral records to eventually get a general history. That's why oral history, history from below, archaeology, that's why this all matters. It's not just reading secondary sources all the time. You won't believe that I am from the family of Nawabs. Nawab, interesting. What do you know about the Iranian Empire? Which one? The Safavids, the Medo-Persians, the Achaemenids, which are the same thing, the Parthians, who the Romans could never defeat, the Sassanids, who the Romans could never defeat, but the Muslims could, the Ilkhanate, the Mongols in Persia. There's been so many empires in Iran. The Timurid Empire. Can you suggest me a car for my GF? Mazda comes to mind. I don't know why. That's true, Harry. The British are British. I appreciate your lionization of British history. May I suggest that it is perhaps a slight overreaction to the constant criticism of British culture and history. I think that it's a very Western thing to criticize histories, and it's developed in the West that we criticize Western history. We do not criticize Eastern history, non-Western history, yet those societies also don't criticize themselves that much. Is it possible for Russia to join EU after Putin gone? Oh, no. The EU, NATO, most of the economic and societal creations in Europe in the last century, most of these supranational organizations were created specifically to be anti-Russian. The Afghans owned it, the Pakistanis owned it, the Indians stole it, and the British purchased it. Sound about right. Oh, by diamond. Oh, thank you, Harry, for sharing that. There's too much Islamic terrorism of Afghans and Pakistanis. Their immigration to Europe is too risky. That's obviously a big issue with EU. That's why Britain wanted to leave the EU. How did the Islamic Golden Age influence the development of science and philosophy in Europe? Great question, Salbani Game, and I'm glad you brought that up, especially we're talking about the more unsavory parts of Islamic history and Islamic culture. There's beautiful, incredible moments, and Jews preferred to live under Islam in the golden age of the Abbasid Caliphate from Baghdad, which lasted from about 800 to about, it was destroyed in 1258, but its golden age was the 900s and 1000s. You had the development of algebra, many medicinal sciences that were extremely important to the development of modern anatomy and biology, including, I think, blood circulation and stuff like that was theorized. The Islamic Golden Age was huge at preserving the works of ancient writers and philosophers and ancient texts, including the Bible, that would become influential for Western thinkers who would read these ideas and then develop their own philosophical understandings. The Muslims were translating and understanding and learning about Aristotle long before Aquinas and many of the Western theologians and philosophers of the Middle Ages. So you can't have Aquinas without Averroes, who's already studying the works of Aristotle. So, yeah. Okay, deadly shooting by police. I don't know if 1260 is right. It all depends. What are the circumstances of those? Obviously, when you don't have police that are armed, or people that are armed, you don't have that number happening. That is a trade-off, to be sure. Was Julius Caesar a tyrant or a hero to the Roman Republic? A tyrant to it's tough, because in many ways his actions led to the destruction of the Republic, but the Republic was already in trouble. You had Sulla, you already had Optimates trying to speak for the people and for their benefits long before Julius Caesar showed up. So ADF, it's something like that. And hello, Ryan. Great to see you. And thank you, William. I appreciate you contributing. That's helpful. Yeah. Islamic Golden Age was basically translation of ancient Greeks. Renaissance in Europe was based on ancient Greek. But you can't have a preservation and development of those texts and ideas without the Muslims in the middle, Hellscream. What do you think of the handover of Hong Kong? I've agreed with you before, Harry. I think that it should have been self-determination by the people of Hong Kong. Americans spend less time learning about non-Western history, and they should. Europeans do because of colonial history, but also because of the closeness to them to the East relative to the United States. But this is a shame. The United States needs to learn more about Latin American history, which is Western history, let alone African, Asian history. It's not there's not enough, and that's why we're here, because we talk about all forms of history. Britain created terrorism in Saudi Arabia through Wahhabi Islam. The British did not create it, but they certainly encouraged the Saud family and made the oil deals that established Saudi Arabia in 1932. Which Iranian empire do you like? My favorite would probably be the Safavids, the Gunpowder Empire, Shia Islam, Yunan. It's fascinating. If World War II was preventable, what could have been done differently? I assume you mean, if you're a friendly neighborhood historian, World War III. But jokes aside, I think there are times where Hitler could have been stopped, where he would not have been so potent. So you might have had a war, but you wouldn't have had the disastrous results for the French. You wouldn't have Poland being divided up. You wouldn't have had Italy being able to run rampshot over Africa, and it might have been able to prevent a full-scale world war. There were certain appeasement was obviously a failure. The fact that that there was too much Hitler favoritism in Europe was a failure. Why do you think Antarctica is the only region on Earth that has a treaty agreement by all nations? Because basically in the midst of a Cold War, they basically decided to to not split Antarctica, but never to colonize it, probably because a fight for the colonization of Antarctica with very little resources and no people there could have caused a land war in a frozen tundra. Did black people colonize southern Europe and teach the Europeans plumbing and water pipes, showering the Moors? That you're thinking of Al-Andalus. I would not consider the Moors to be black. There is a huge. It's hard because North Africa, the Maghreb, that area has been distinguished because of its associations with Islam. It's usually lumped in with the Middle East. It's certainly a liminal area between the Middle East and Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa is significantly different in culture and history. Not fully. The Romans had plumbing. And aqueducts and things like that. Showering, yes, many of those things came to Spain through the intercession of the Moors in Al-Andalus, which was an Islamic golden age of its own. Yes, Bolshevism was made by the Jews. Yes, and therefore I love that argument. That's like it's such a ridiculous idea. Islam was made by an Arab. I mean, this is just because someone of a certain background makes it doesn't mean everybody in that group, fits on it. So anyways, I've been going a long time. I'm over 70 minutes. Let me see here. And yes, I hope I can continue the great work. Please like and subscribe. And I've actually caught up to the chat. The Mughal Empire fell because of the British and the French and the Maharatha Confederacy. Basically, a bunch of Indian princes were sick and tired of the Mughal telling them what to do. The British and French exploited that, and the Mughal Empire disintegrated. And yes, the Gunpowder Empire. You'll love my video on the Safavids, so go check that out. Thank you, Solve. I'll do what I can. Thoughts on Zionism. One of the most misunderstood terms in history does not refer to seizing all of the Middle East for the Israelis. The Israelis themselves sometimes misunderstand that. It is the process and belief that Lord Balfour said in his infamous Balfour Declaration that Israel has a right to exist and be populated by Jewish people. That's all. And Tipu Sultan was defeated by the British. Yes, that's true. The British defeated a lot of people. Nazism, and I love the vacation. Thank you. And thank you, Bende. What do you think about LGBTQ influence on children, especially in Europe? I think it's getting a bit too much because they're not even in legal sex age. Standards of moral behavior from Americans applied to Europeans is unfair because the Europeans have a very different code of how they express themselves in art and literature and in sexual behavior than the Americans do. But I would never just blame LGBTQ communities for that. I think that's a little biased. What do you think of the lefties and immigrants trying to undermine the people of the UK, saying we're all immigrants? It's harder. That's an easier case to make in the United States, which has that really strong case to be made. But in Great Britain, it's harder, which is weird because they have, it's an island. Now you just need a nice pipe. I do have a nice pipe. I'm not smoking in the studio now. As we hopefully you join, become a member, we can afford better technology, a better filtration system, some air conditioning in here would be nice because you guys know how much I sweat in here when it gets hot, and other stuff like that. So consider getting some perks, joining as a member, all of that stuff. Anything helps as we continue to grow and want to get better equipment, better things to make this channel better for all of you. So consider that. Don't want to pick either union. I hate both, obviously, the Nazis and the USSR. If you look at but I kind of summed this up. Stalin was worse than Hitler. But that's not saying that's saying someone is less worse than something doesn't make them any less worse than they actually are. Why do you think Europeans converted to Judaism? That didn't happen. Some Europeans did, but most Europeans converted to the derivative of Judaism, Christianity, usually through force. And thank you, Ruben, for watching that video. I am not Jewish. I'm not Jewish and I'm not Arab. And I want fighting to stop, and I want the West Bank to be settled by the Palestinians because it has been already, and there is no reason for the Israelis to be going in there and settling. So I'm more than willing to look at both sides of the issue. Why do British people call Indian kings dirty? It's a racist undertone with that whole social Darwinism thing. Basically, the British had to justify their colonization of that area after they had already ended slavery, calling them culturally inferior and seeing it as their job, the white man's burden, to civilize Africa and India was a huge justification for horrifyingly terrible racist and imperialist behavior by most of the Europeans. And the United States to a lesser degree, not as direct, but indirect to be sure. Yeah, Hal screamed. There are certain things children. It's all about when do you tell children about this? How much power is in the hands of families, and how much power is in the hands of schools? Culture, technology has made it so that children learn these things a lot earlier than may have been necessary or may have been predicted by a previous generation. And yes, Churchill was a racist. I do agree with you, Taib. By our standards and definitions, Churchill was a racist. If Churchill lived today, it would be very hard not to argue he is not. Pick up an account for $400 AC. See, that's what we're building towards. So we're $398 towards that, thanks to William. So, you've just shown me you've been white guilted. I love this. I get you're a Zionist pig on one end, and I get you're a white guilted guy on the other. If I'm being criticized by the left and the right, I know for one thing, I'm talking about history, geopolitics, and everything the correct way. Did you play God of War? I've heard it's okay. I need to go back and play it. Stop giving in to Jewish propaganda as if they are good people. They only play a victim and bomb my country, Lebanon. First of all, Leona, I'm very sorry. I love Lebanon. I think Lebanon is fantastic. It has incredible history, both its own native culture. It's one of the most ancient societies there, and everything. But I mean, the Cedars of Lebanon. They are an ancient and powerful people. And thank you, ADF. I really appreciate that. EDF and William are my heroes of the chat. I appreciate that. We're going to be doing private live streams, private Q&As and chats and stuff like that, and early release and all of that. If you become members, we're going to be starting that soon as we get our members going. But thank you, ADF, and thank you, William, again. But Leona, I am very sorry that is happening. Part of the reason is not because of Lebanon itself, it's because of Hezbollah being basically allowed to continue to exist, and Hezbollah wants the Jewish state to be destroyed, and the Jews aren't huge fans of that, those living in Israel. That isn't Jewish propaganda, that's just a fact. It's what Hezbollah has wanted, and obviously they want this because they believe that the Jews are wrong. It isn't just Israel that would be perpetuating propaganda, it would be Lebanon, and also, it would be not Lebanon, it would be the Hezbollah and Hamas. So, yes, I'm not giving in to propaganda. If I am, and there's plenty of other people that are. So thank you, William. Thank you, ADF. Thank you, everyone else, for joining us here. I've gone about 20 minutes over just because I so enjoy all of our conversations and our questions. And Leona, I feel your pain. I understand where you're coming from. Please consider liking and subscribing and joining us again, and we'll talk more about this stuff and all sorts of great history, as we always do at the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel. And join us for our special live stream lecture tomorrow, where I will be discussing Steve, hi. Well, I'll be discussing the history of Memorial Day and its impact. So join us 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'm going to be sharing my video of Memorial Day and its history, and my video today of Queen Victoria. It's her birthday. 206. Yeah, and so go check that out. What are a couple top things you've learned from 1920 to 2020 history? Steve, that's that's a live stream lecture topic, man. Great question though. I've learned that that appeasement is a horrible foreign policy. There's a lesson I've learned. You think Islam will destroy Europe or USA? Which is worse, woke or Islam? I Oh boy. I don't think Islam in itself is a problem. I think Islam has a problem, and the biggest victims of that are Islam itself. It gives it a bad reputation, and many of the victims of radical Islam are themselves Islamic. And yes. And much love, take care, all of that great stuff. And it's the world's favorite building because a lot of people think it's a temple, and because it's beautifully constructed in that Islamic pattern of geometric consistency, beautiful white rock. I think is it sandstone? I don't remember what it is off the top of my head, but yes. And it's actually a tomb. A lot of people think it's a temple. It is actually a tomb built by Shah Jahan. It's a love story for his wife, who he wanted to have the proper burial. So, with all of that, I take my leave. Subscribe if you haven't already, and thank you so much for a wonderful chat. Make sure to show love to my moderators, Freshly, Rodolfo, and Harry and Hars, who did a great job too. You'll tell everyone you know. Like, subscribe, and consider joining for some of those extra perks. Take care. I will see you tomorrow, 6 p.m. Eastern, for our live stream lecture on Memorial Day. And remember, in the meantime,